Sarah Chen sat in the back corner of advanced xenobiology, her fingers dancing across her datapad while Professor Kelvin droned on about Terran adaptation protocols. She kept her head down, brown hair falling like a curtain between her and the rest of the class. 23 other students filled the lecture hall, most of them aliens from a dozen different species, all enrolled in the Galactic Academy's most prestigious program. None of them paid her any attention. That was exactly how she wanted it. The Vraxian in front of her, all four arms gesturing wildly, debated with his Keltorian partner about protein synthesis in high-gravity environments. To her left, a group of Andromedans whispered about the upcoming combat simulations, their translucent skin flickering with excitement. Sarah kept her eyes on her notes, adding observations that the professor had missed, correcting errors in the displayed data with quick annotations that only she would ever see. Being invisible was a skill she had perfected over 3 semesters. While other humans at the academy formed loud groups, joining clubs and making spectacles of themselves, Sarah melted into the background. She submitted her assignments on time, scored average marks that never drew attention, and spoke only when directly called upon. The few times professors had looked her way, they saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a quiet, unremarkable human girl who was just grateful to be there. The truth was buried so deep that even the Academy's advanced security systems would need clearance from Earth's high command to access it. Sarah had made certain of that before she ever set foot on the station. After class, she gathered her things slowly, waiting for the rush of students to clear before making her way to the exit. The Academy station rotated lazily against the backdrop of a purple nebula, its massive rings housing everything from training facilities to diplomatic quarters. Sarah had memorized every corridor, every shortcut, every blind spot in the security cameras during her first week. Old habits died hard. The cafeteria buzzed with afternoon energy when she arrived. She picked up a tray of standard human nutrition paste, some fruit and water, then found her usual spot near the viewing window. From here, she could watch the entire room while appearing to gaze at the stars beyond. 3 tables over, Marcus Webb held court with his usual crowd, regaling them with exaggerated stories about Earth's military academies. He wore his father's admiral insignia on his jacket, making sure everyone knew about his prestigious lineage. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Marcus had failed the entrance exams for Earth's actual military programs twice. His father's money had bought him a spot at the Galactic Academy instead, where he could pretend to be something he wasn't. She understood pretending, though her reasons were very different. Her datapad chimed softly, a message from her roommate Kira, a bubbly Centaurian who treated Sarah like a pet project, constantly trying to drag her to social events. Sarah typed a polite decline to tonight's mixer, citing a heavy study load. Kira would be disappointed but not surprised. She had stopped taking Sarah's rejections personally after the first month. As Sarah ate, she observed the social dynamics playing out around her. The Vraxians clustered together, their hierarchical culture making them uncomfortable with the casual mixing of other species. The Keltorians floated from group to group, their natural diplomacy making them everyone's friend. The handful of humans scattered throughout formed their own mini-society, already establishing pecks and alliances that would follow them beyond the academy. None of them noticed when Lieutenant Commander Zhao entered the cafeteria. Sarah noticed immediately. Her posture didn't change, her expression remained neutral, but every sense sharpened. Zhao was human, mid-40s, wearing the crisp uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps. But Sarah recognized the way he moved, the way his eyes swept the room in a practiced pattern. Military intelligence, probably naval special operations based on the subtle scarring on his left hand from a plasma burn. He was looking for someone. Sarah took another bite of her meal, chewing slowly, her peripheral vision tracking Zhao as he spoke to the Academy's administrative assistant near the entrance. The assistant, a nervous Palladian, nodded repeatedly and gestured toward the main office. Zhao thanked him and left, but not before his gaze swept across the cafeteria one more time. Sarah's instincts screamed at her, but she forced herself to finish her meal at a normal pace. Rushing would draw attention. Instead, she pulled up her class schedule on her datapad, reviewing tomorrow's assignments as if nothing had happened. Around her, conversations continued. Laughter echoed off the high ceilings, and the daily life of the academy rolled on without pause. 20 minutes later, she deposited her tray and made her way toward the residential wing. The corridors here were quieter, with soft lighting designed to accommodate the various species' circadian rhythms. Sarah's room was on the 4th level, shared with Kira, who wouldn't be back for hours thanks to her busy social calendar. She palmed the door lock and stepped inside, immediately checking the small telltales she had placed around the room. A hair across the desk drawer, precisely positioned. A data pad at an exact angle on her nightstand, all undisturbed. Sarah allowed herself to relax slightly, sitting on her bed and pulling off her shoes. Her military file was sealed tighter than a black hole. She had made sure of that personally, calling in favors from people who owed her more than they could ever repay. The Galactic Academy had access only to her basic records: birth date, home planet, education history, and standard medical data. Everything else was classified at levels that required DNA verification, retinal scans, and authorization codes that changed every 6 hours. So why was naval intelligence on the station? Sarah stood and moved to her desk, activating her personal terminal with a gesture that looked casual but initiated 7 different security protocols. She pulled up the Academy's public directory, searching for any mention of visiting officials. Nothing. The daily bulletin listed scheduled speakers and guests for the next month. No one from Earth's military or intelligence services. That meant Zhao's visit was unofficial, which made it either very important or very dangerous. Possibly both. Sarah closed the terminal and lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling while her mind worked through possibilities. After 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity, something had shifted. Someone had asked questions. Someone with enough clearance to get answers, or at least enough to know that questions existed that they weren't allowed to ask. She had prepared for this scenario, had contingency plans layered within backup protocols, but she had hoped to make it through all 4 years without implementing any of them. The stars beyond her window continued their ancient dance, indifferent to human concerns. Sarah closed her eyes and began running through her options, each one carefully evaluated and stored away in the part of her mind that never truly rested. Tomorrow she would attend classes as usual, maintain her routine, and watch for any signs that Zhao's visit had anything to do with her. Being invisible was a skill, but staying invisible required constant vigilance. Sarah had learned that lesson in Blood and Fire, in places where the Galactic Academy's brightest students couldn't imagine in their darkest nightmares. She had come here for a reason, and she wasn't done yet. The morning simulation lab hummed with anticipation as students filed into their assigned stations. Sarah arrived exactly 7 minutes before the session began, neither early enough to seem eager nor late enough to draw attention. The lab itself was a marvel of galactic technology, capable of creating fully immersive combat scenarios that felt absolutely real without any actual danger. Professor Thex, a towering Dravian with scales that shifted between blue and green depending on his mood, stood at the central console. His reputation preceded him. He had served in the Galactic Defense Force for 30 years before retiring to teach, and his simulations were legendary for their brutality. Students who excelled here received fast-track recommendations to military positions across the galaxy. Sarah had been deliberately failing his simulations for 2 months. Today's scenario involved a hostage rescue on a mining station. The class would be divided into teams of 4, each attempting to extract civilians while dealing with hostile forces. Standard tactical exercise, the kind that separated natural leaders from followers. Sarah made sure to always be the latter. She was assigned to a team with 3 other students: Marcus Webb, who immediately declared himself team leader; Zrix, a methodical Vraxian engineer; and Lena, a Keltorian medic with impressive field experience. Sarah nodded politely as Marcus outlined his strategy, which involved a straightforward frontal assault backed by Zrix's technical skills. It was a terrible plan that would get them all killed in the first 5 minutes. Sarah said nothing. The simulation began with their team materializing in a docking bay. Alarms blared, red emergency lights strobed across grimy metal walls, and the acrid smell of smoke filled their helmets. Marcus charged forward immediately, pulse rifle raised, barking orders that his teammates scrambled to follow. Sarah fell into step behind them, her weapon held in the standard academy grip, her movements textbook perfect. Around a corner, they encountered their first hostile. Marcus opened fire, his shots going wide in his excitement. The enemy combatant returned fire with better accuracy, and Marcus's shield flickered dangerously low. Zrix deployed a defensive barrier while Lena moved to provide covering fire. Sarah aimed carefully and missed her shot by exactly the margin she had calculated, close enough to look like she was trying, but far enough to be useless. The scenario played out predictably. Marcus's aggressive tactics left them exposed. Zrix performed admirably but couldn't compensate for their leader's mistakes. Lena managed to keep them alive longer than they deserved, but eventually the simulation ended with 3 of them tagged as casualties and only Sarah surviving, though she accomplished nothing of value. Professor Thex's voice boomed through the lab as the simulation dissolved. His scales had shifted to a disappointed gray. He reviewed each team's performance with brutal honesty, praising some and destroying others with equally measured criticism. When he reached Sarah's team, his massive eyes focused on Marcus. The lecture that followed was thorough and humiliating. Marcus's face reddened as Professor Thex detailed every tactical error, every moment of poor judgment, every casualty that resulted from ego over strategy. The rest of the class watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't on the receiving end. Sarah kept her expression neutral, neither enjoying Marcus's embarrassment nor defending him. Then Professor Thex turned to her, and she felt the weight of his ancient gaze. He said nothing for a long moment, just studied her with an intensity that made several nearby students shift uncomfortably. Finally, he spoke in his rumbling voice that carried across the entire lab. "Miss Chen, you survived." It was a statement, not praise. Sarah nodded acknowledgement. "You survived by doing nothing of consequence. You followed orders, maintained safe positions, and ensured your own preservation above all else." He paused, his scales flickering between gray and a curious amber. "In 30 years of combat, I learned that there are 2 types of soldiers who survive by doing nothing. Cowards who freeze under pressure, and veterans who know when to conserve their strength. Which are you?" The lab fell silent, every student's attention fixed on Sarah, many of them seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time all semester. Marcus looked hopeful, eager for someone else to face the professor's wrath. Lena appeared concerned, her empathic senses probably detecting Sarah's carefully controlled heartbeat. Sarah met Professor Thex's eyes and allowed herself a small, calculated hesitation before answering. "I'm just trying to pass the class, sir. I'm not cut out for combat." It was the perfect response for the character she had built, honest enough to be believable, humble enough to deflect attention, and disappointing enough that Professor Thex would lose interest. She watched his scales shift fully to gray as he dismissed her with a grunt, already moving on to evaluate the next team. But she had felt something in that exchange, a flicker of recognition in the old warrior's eyes before he looked away. Professor Thex had seen real combat, had probably stood shoulder to shoulder with soldiers who mastered the art of appearing less than they were. He might not know what Sarah was hiding, but he suspected she was hiding something that was dangerous. After class, Sarah gathered her equipment and prepared to leave when she noticed Marcus blocking her path. 2 of his friends flanked him, both human and both wearing expressions of poorly concealed hostility. "That was embarrassing," Marcus said, his voice low enough that others couldn't easily hear, getting lectured like that in front of everyone. Sarah kept her tone neutral. "Professor Thex was just doing his job. Your plan had some good elements, but execution in the field is always harder than theory. It was diplomatic, non-threatening, exactly what someone trying to avoid conflict would say." Marcus studied her face, looking for sarcasm or mockery and finding nothing but bland pleasantness. "You didn't even try to help," one of his friends interjected, a stocky boy named Chen who had no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname. "Just let us walk into that ambush." Sarah shrugged slightly. "I'm not experienced enough to question the team leader's decisions during a live scenario. That's why we have these simulations, right? To learn from mistakes safely." The response deflated their aggression. Marcus clearly wanted someone to blame for his public humiliation, but Sarah refused to provide a target. After another moment of uncomfortable silence, he stepped aside and gestured for her to pass. "Yeah, well, next time speak up if you see something. We're supposed to be a team." Sarah nodded and walked past them, feeling their eyes on her back until she turned the corner. Once out of sight, she allowed her shoulders to relax fractionally. That confrontation could have escalated, but she had navigated it successfully, remaining unremarkable while not appearing weak enough to become a target for bullying. The residential corridor was quiet at this hour, most students still in classes or training. Sarah palmed open her door and froze. Lieutenant Commander Zhao sat at her desk, reviewing something on her personal terminal. Sarah's training screamed at her to react, but she forced herself to simply close the door behind her and stand there, confusion and concern playing across her features instead of the cold calculation actually running through her mind. Zhao looked up and smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Miss Chen, sorry for the intrusion. I hope you don't mind, but the Academy granted me access to conduct some routine interviews with students from Earth. Diplomatic Corps outreach program. It was a lie. A practiced one, delivered smoothly, but still a lie. The real question was whether Zhao knew that Sarah knew it was a lie. "Oh," Sarah said, injecting uncertainty into her voice. "I didn't know we had anyone from the Diplomatic Corps visiting. Should I have been notified?" "Last-minute visit," Zhao replied easily, gesturing to her roommate's chair. "Please sit. This will only take a few minutes. I'm gathering feedback about how human students are adapting to the multicultural environment here. Earth's government wants to ensure our citizens feel supported and represented." Sarah sat slowly, her mind racing through options and contingencies. Zhao's presence here in her private space going through her terminal meant that someone had connected dots they weren't supposed to connect. The question was how many dots and what picture they formed. "I'm adapting fine," she said, maintaining the character of a slightly nervous student facing unexpected official attention. "The Academy has been welcoming, and the alien species are fascinating to learn alongside." Zhao nodded, pulling out his own datapad and making notes. He asked standard questions about her classes, her social integration, her future plans. Sarah answered each one with rehearsed mediocrity, painting herself as an unremarkable student with unremarkable ambitions. But underneath the mundane interview, a different conversation was happening. Zhao's questions probed gently at the edges of her background, testing her responses, looking for inconsistencies. He mentioned her hometown with a detail that wasn't in her public file. He referenced a teacher from her secondary education who had actually taught at a different school. Small errors, deliberate ones designed to see if she would correct him. Sarah let each mistake pass without comment, responding as someone would who wasn't paying close attention or didn't remember every detail of their own fabricated history. The Academy's network security was impressive by civilian standards, layered with quantum encryption, and monitored by artificial intelligence systems designed to detect intrusion attempts. For someone like Sarah, who had spent 2 years penetrating enemy military networks during the Outer Colonies conflict, it was merely an interesting puzzle. She waited until 3 in the morning, when the station's biological rhythms reached their lowest ebb. Kira snored softly in her bed across the room, exhausted from another social event. Sarah sat in darkness, her terminal's glow turned down to near invisibility, fingers dancing across keys with practiced silence. The first layer of security fell away like tissue paper. Sarah slipped through the Academy's student network, appearing to anyone monitoring as routine background traffic. She had spent months mapping the system's architecture, identifying weaknesses, creating backdoors that looked like natural coding errors. Now those preparations paid dividends. The administrative network proved more challenging. Here, actual security professionals monitored traffic patterns and investigated anomalies. Sarah routed her access through 17 different terminals scattered across the station, bouncing her signal through lab equipment, environmental controls, and entertainment systems. To anyone tracking her digital footprint, she appeared to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Finding Zhao's access logs took 40 minutes of careful searching. He had been thorough, requesting records on every human student currently enrolled. But his queries hadn't been random. He had used specific search parameters, looking for students with gaps in their background checks, inconsistencies in their documentation, or sealed records that required elevated clearance to access. Sarah's file had triggered multiple alerts. She felt her jaw tighten as she read through Zhao's notes. He had compiled a list of 19 students whose backgrounds warranted further investigation. Sarah was number 3 on that list, flagged for having an unusually sparse digital footprint for someone her age. In an era where every human's life was documented from birth through constant surveillance and social media, Sarah's past contained suspicious blank spaces. Zhao had attempted to access her sealed military records and been denied. That denial itself had raised more flags. Why would a 19-year-old civilian student have military records sealed at such a high classification level? The lieutenant commander had sent a request to Earth's Naval Intelligence Command asking for clarification. The response had been terse and absolute. Access denied, investigation suspended, no further inquiries authorized. That should have ended it. But Zhao had included a personal note in his log, one not meant for official transmission. Pattern matches previous deep cover insertions. Recommend surveillance but no contact. Will monitor for 6 months before filing formal report. Sarah read those lines 3 times, analyzing every word. Zhao suspected she was an intelligence asset. Someone placed at the academy for purposes he couldn't determine. His recommendation suggested patience, observation, building a case before acting. That gave her time, but not much. More concerning was what she found in the associated files. Zhao wasn't the only one asking questions. 3 weeks ago, a Vraxian diplomatic observer had submitted a query about human military capabilities. That query had mentioned the academy specifically, asking about human students' performance in tactical simulations. Someone had noticed that human students, despite their species' reputation for combat effectiveness, consistently underperformed compared to their alien counterparts. Someone was looking for humans who weren't trying their best. Sarah closed those files and dug deeper. Following digital breadcrumbs through layers of bureaucratic communication, the Vraxian Empire had become increasingly concerned about humanity's rapid expansion into contested space. While publicly maintaining friendly relations, their intelligence services were actively assessing human military capabilities, looking for weaknesses to exploit or threats to prepare for. The Galactic Academy, with its diverse student population and realistic combat simulations, provided perfect ground for such assessments. By studying how different species performed under pressure, intelligence analysts could build profiles of military capabilities, tactical doctrines, and individual species' strengths and weaknesses, and humanity. Despite winning the Outer Colonies conflict through superior tactics and shocking resilience, was allowing its students to appear weak and disorganized. Whether through genuine lack of skill or something more deliberate, the pattern had attracted attention. Sarah sat back, her mind working through implications. She had come to the academy with a specific mission, one that required maintaining a low profile while gathering intelligence on potential threats to Earth's expanding sphere of influence. Her cover as an unremarkable student had served that purpose perfectly for 3 semesters. But now multiple parties were circling, asking questions, looking for patterns. Continuing to hide in plain sight might draw more attention than calculated exposure. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. Incoming message, routed through an encrypted channel that very few people had access to. Sarah's stomach dropped as she recognized the encryption signature. Captain Rivera, her actual commanding officer and one of only 3 people who knew her real identity. The message was brief. Report compromise status. New orders pending assessment, Sarah typed rapidly. Outlining Zhao's investigation, the Vraxian queries, and her current risk evaluation, she sent the message and waited, knowing that Rivera was probably on the other side of the galaxy, but maintaining constant monitoring of all deep cover assets. The response came faster than she expected. Maintain cover. Expect package delivery within 48 hours. Authorization Alpha 77 Tango. Rivera out. Sarah deleted both messages, scrubbed her access logs, and backed out of the network carefully, erasing traces of her presence as she went. Whatever Rivera was sending, it carried the highest operational priority. Alpha 7 Tango was code for a mission-critical delivery that took precedence over everything except immediate threats to Earth itself. She shut down her terminal and lay back on her bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to the core problem. She needed to redirect attention away from herself while continuing her intelligence gathering. The best way to do that would be to give investigators something else to focus on, someone more interesting than a quiet student who kept her head down. Marcus Webb's face came to mind, and Sarah allowed herself a slight smile in the darkness. The Admiral's son was loud, confident, and exactly the kind of person intelligence services love to investigate. His father's position gave him access to classified information. His personality made him prone to showing off, and his connections throughout the Academy's human community made him a natural focal point. With the right push, Sarah could make Marcus look like exactly the kind of security risk that would consume Zhao's attention for months. The next morning, Sarah attended her xenolinguistics class and positioned herself near a group of students, discussing the upcoming diplomatic reception. The Vraxian Empire was sending a delegation to tour the academy, a goodwill gesture meant to strengthen ties with the Galactic Council. It was also a perfect opportunity for intelligence gathering on both sides. During a break, Sarah carefully maneuvered herself next to Marcus, who was holding court with his usual group. She waited for a lull in conversation, then spoke just loud enough to be overheard. My father mentioned that reception in his last message. He's hoping I can make some connections with the Vraxian delegation. Earth's diplomatic corps is really pushing for closer military cooperation. It was a complete fabrication. Sarah's cover identity listed her father as a low-level agricultural administrator with no diplomatic connections. But Marcus, who never paid attention to anyone he didn't consider important, wouldn't know that. He turned to her, interest flickering in his eyes. Your father works in the diplomatic corps? Adjacent to it, Sarah said, maintaining her usual quiet demeanor. Nothing exciting like your father's position, but he occasionally handles logistics for diplomatic missions. He asked me to attend the reception and listen more than talk, get a feel for how the Vraxians view human expansion. Marcus nodded knowingly, falling into the trap of assuming everyone was as obsessed with status and connections as he was. My father says the Vraxians are getting nervous about our colonization pace. They're worried we're going to box them out of the outer territories. That makes sense, Sarah replied, then lowered her voice slightly. My father mentioned something about that in his message. Some kind of tension over resource rights in the Deneb sector. He was pretty cryptic about it, probably classified information he shouldn't have told me. She watched Marcus's expression shift from casual interest to eager attention. Nothing motivated him more than the possibility of knowing classified information that others didn't. Sarah had just painted a target on herself that would draw attention, but the right kind of attention. Anyone investigating her now would find a student who talked carelessly about potentially sensitive information. A security risk through naivety rather than malice. The Deneb sector, Marcus repeated, his mind clearly working. That's where most of... The diplomatic reception was held in the Academy's Grand Hall, a soaring space with transparent walls that provided a panoramic view of the nebula beyond. Students mingled with visiting dignitaries, faculty members facilitated introductions, and servers glided through the crowd offering refreshments calibrated to dozens of different species biology. Sarah arrived wearing a simple but elegant dress that Kira had insisted on lending her. Her roommate had spent an hour styling Sarah's hair into something more sophisticated than her usual practical bun, chattering excitedly about making good impressions and building networks. Sarah had endured the attention with good grace, knowing that appearing to care about such things reinforced her new cover as someone trying too hard to seem important. The Vraxian delegation commanded attention at the center of the room. 5 diplomats in ceremonial armor that gleamed under the hall's ambient lighting, their scales shifting through formal color patterns that denoted their ranks and houses. Ambassador Krexith led them, an imposing figure who had served in their military before transitioning to diplomatic service. Sarah had studied his file extensively. He was shrewd, calculating, and absolutely committed to advancing Vraxian interests in contested territories. Marcus held court nearby, surrounded by students eager to hear his theories about human-Vraxian relations. He had clearly done research after their conversation, and Sarah could hear him dropping terms like resource allocation, doctrine, and territorial expansion protocols, with the confidence of someone who had just learned enough to sound informed to people who knew less. Sarah maintained her position near the refreshment station, appearing interested in the proceedings while actually conducting surveillance. She mapped the room's exits, identified security personnel both obvious and concealed, and noted which academy staff members carried themselves with the rigid posture of military training, despite their civilian positions. Professor Thex stood near one wall, his scales a neutral blue-gray as he observed the gathering with the patience of someone who had attended thousands of such events. His eyes swept across the room regularly, and Sarah felt his gaze linger on her twice. The old warrior was still suspicious, still wondering why she seemed so content to remain unnoticed. An hour into the reception, Sarah noticed a human woman she didn't recognize speaking with the academy's director. mid-30s wearing Earth's diplomatic corps uniform, moving with the controlled precision that suggested combat training despite her civilian role. She caught Sarah's eye briefly, then looked away. But that single glance had been enough. Captain Rivera had sent someone in person. Sarah waited 15 minutes, then excused herself from a boring conversation about xenobiology ethics and made her way toward the restrooms. The corridors outside the Grand Hall were quiet, monitored by security cameras that Sarah had already mapped. She knew which angles they covered and which blind spots existed in their coverage. The woman from the reception followed 3 minutes later, maintaining professional distance until they were both in the restroom's antechamber. She checked the stalls quickly, confirmed they were alone, and activated a small device that would scramble any listening devices. "Commander Chen," she said quietly, and Sarah felt the weight of her real rank settle back onto her shoulders after months of pretending it didn't exist. "I'm Lieutenant Vega, Naval Intelligence. Captain Rivera sends her regards." Sarah nodded acknowledgement. "The package?" Vega handed her a small data chip disguised as a piece of jewelry, an earring that would pass any casual inspection. "Mission update and new objectives. High priority." Captain Rivera emphasized that maintaining your cover is secondary to the information on this chip. That was significant. Rivera never compromised operational security lightly. If she was willing to risk Sarah's cover, the situation was serious. "What's the overview?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice low. Vega glanced at the door, then back to Sarah. "The Vraxians are planning something big. Our intelligence suggests they're preparing to challenge human expansion in the Deneb sector, possibly with military force. They've been quietly mobilizing resources and repositioning fleets. We need detailed information on their military capabilities, their tactical doctrines, and their timeline. And they think I can get that from Academy students?" "No," Vega said. "We think you can get it from Ambassador Krexith's personal security detail. 2 of them are active military officers on temporary diplomatic assignment. They'll be running training sessions with Academy students tomorrow as part of the cultural exchange program. You need to be in those sessions." Sarah considered the implications. Inserting herself into military training sessions would require abandoning her carefully maintained profile of mediocrity. She would have to demonstrate capabilities that she had spent months hiding. "This will burn my cover," she said flatly. "Possibly," Vega acknowledged. "But Earth needs this intelligence more than we need you to remain undetected. If the Vraxians are preparing for conflict, we need to know before they move. You're our best positioned asset to gather that information." Sarah had known this moment might come, had prepared for it mentally, but actually facing it felt different. 3 semesters of careful work, of maintaining a persona that allowed her to operate freely, about to be discarded for a single high-value intelligence opportunity. "What's my extraction protocol if this goes wrong?" she asked. "You won't have one," Vega replied bluntly. "If you're compromised, you'll have to rely on your cover as a student who happens to be very skilled. Play it as natural talent previously hidden. Naval Intelligence will deny any connection to you until we can arrange extraction, which could take weeks. Standard procedure for deep cover operations, but never comfortable to hear confirmed." Sarah would be completely exposed, relying on her own skills and quick thinking to survive if the situation deteriorated. "Understood," Sarah said. "When do the training sessions begin?" "Tomorrow at OR 900, Combat Simulation Lab 7. Voluntary participation, but the Vraxian officers will be evaluating students for potential exchange programs. It's a recruitment opportunity disguised as cultural exchange." Vega paused. "Commander, I've read your file." "Your full file. What you did during the Outer Colonies conflict was remarkable. If anyone can pull this off, it's you." Sarah accepted the compliment with a slight nod, but her mind was already racing ahead, planning how to reveal her capabilities in a way that appeared natural, while getting close enough to the Vraxian officers to gather meaningful intelligence. Vega deactivated her scrambler and left first. Sarah waited 2 minutes, then returned to the reception, slipping back into the crowd as if she had never left. She smiled at appropriate moments, laughed at jokes she barely heard, and played the role of an engaged student while her mind worked through scenarios and contingencies. Across the room, she saw Professor Thex watching her again, his scales flickering to an interested amber. The old warrior's instincts were good. He sensed something had changed, even if he couldn't articulate what. Near the Vraxian delegation, Marcus was introducing himself to Ambassador Krexith with enthusiastic confidence. Sarah watched the ambassador's polite but dismissive response, the way his scales shifted to patterns that indicated boredom mixed with mild amusement. Marcus represented exactly what the Vraxians expected from humans: loud, confident, and ultimately unthreatening. Sarah had spent months reinforcing that perception. Tomorrow she would begin dismantling it. The reception continued for another hour. Sarah made appropriate small talk, deflected questions about her fictional diplomatic connections with self-deprecating humor, and generally played the role of someone who had exaggerated their importance to seem interesting. Several students laughed with her about it, and she could see their assessment of her shifting from potentially interesting to harmlessly foolish. Good. Let them think they had figured her out. When the evening finally ended, Sarah returned to her room and waited for Kira to fall asleep before accessing the data chip Vega had provided. The information it contained was extensive: detailed intelligence assessments, background profiles on the Vraxian officers, specific information gaps that needed filling, and contingency protocols in case of various complications. Captain Rivera had also included a personal message. "Sarah, you've done excellent work maintaining your cover. I wouldn't ask you to compromise it if we had any other options. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and remember that your survival matters more than any intelligence you might gather. The Vraxians respect strength and skill. Show them what humanity is capable of, but be smart about it. Rivera out." Sarah read through the files 3 times, memorizing key details and analyzing the Vraxian officers' backgrounds. Both were combat veterans with distinguished service records. They would recognize real skill when they saw it, would respect competence and despise pretense. She couldn't approach this halfway. If she was going to reveal her capabilities, she needed to do it completely and convincingly. The question was how to explain her sudden transformation from mediocre student to highly skilled operator. She needed a story that was plausible, that wouldn't immediately trigger security investigations, and that would give her credibility with the Vraxian officers. Sarah considered several options before settling on Combat Simulation Lab 7 was smaller than the main training facility, designed for specialized instruction rather than large class exercises. When Sarah arrived at precisely 0855, 30 students had already gathered, a mix of species all eager to learn from the Vraxian military officers. Marcus was there naturally, positioned near the front with his usual entourage. Professor Thex stood against one wall, observing with his characteristic quiet intensity. The 2 Vraxian officers were impressive even by their species standards. Commander Vrath stood over 7 feet tall, his scales displaying combat scars that created distinctive patterns in the otherwise smooth surface. His companion, Captain Zena, was slightly smaller, but moved with a fluid grace that suggested years of intensive training. Both wore ceremonial armor modified for training purposes, and both carried themselves with the absolute confidence of veterans who had nothing left to prove. Sarah took a position in the middle of the group, not front and center but not hiding in the back either. She needed to be noticed but not appear desperate for attention. Several students glanced at her curiously, surprised to see the quiet girl from their classes volunteering for an advanced training session. Commander Vrath began speaking in accented but perfect Standard Galactic. His voice carried authority that commanded immediate attention. "Welcome, students. Captain Zena and I volunteered for this cultural exchange because we believe understanding different species' combat doctrines is essential for peace. Today we will demonstrate Vraxian combat philosophy and invite you to participate in practical exercises." He gestured toward the simulation consoles. "Our first scenario will be simple: close quarters combat in a confined environment. We will divide into teams, and each team will face challenges designed to test adaptability and tactical thinking. This is not a competition, but an opportunity to learn." It was absolutely a competition. Sarah could see it in the way both officers evaluated the assembled students, in the subtle body language that suggested they were ranking everyone present based on first impressions. The Vraxians respected martial prowess above almost everything else. They were looking for students who demonstrated potential, who might be worth cultivating as future allies or watching as future threats. The teams were assembled randomly, or so it appeared. Sarah found herself grouped with 3 Andromedan students she vaguely recognized from advanced physics. They introduced themselves politely, clearly uncertain about being paired with the quiet human girl who never spoke up in class. Commander Vrath explained the scenario. Their team would need to retrieve an objective from a hostile facility, while dealing with automated defenses and enemy combatants, standard military exercise. But the Vraxian officers would be actively adjusting difficulty based on performance, making it progressively harder for teams that showed competence. Sarah's team was third to enter the simulation. She watched the first two teams closely, analyzing Commander Vrath's tactical choices and Captain Zena's evaluation criteria. The first team, led by a confident Keltorian diplomat, attempted a stealthy approach and got massacred when they triggered a hidden sensor. The second team, heavy on Vraxian students, employed their species' traditional aggressive tactics and performed adequately, but without distinction. When Sarah's team entered the simulation, the three Andromedans immediately looked to her, waiting for someone to take command. The oldest, a student named Vex, finally spoke up. "Does anyone have military training?" Sarah made her decision. "Some," she said quietly. "Enough to know we need to assess before we move." Vex nodded gratefully, clearly relieved someone was willing to lead. "What do you suggest?" Sarah moved to a vantage point, scanning the simulated environment with practiced efficiency. The facility was industrial. Lots of cover, but also lots of potential ambush points. Automated turrets covered the main approaches, but she spotted blind spots in their coverage patterns. Enemy combatants patrolled in groups of 3, moving in patterns that suggested professional training. "We're being tested on adaptability," Sarah said, keeping her voice low. "The officers are watching how we think, not just whether we succeed. Vex, you're best with technology. Can you hack into the facility systems and disable the turrets?" Vex examined the simulation's parameters. "Possibly, but it will take time and leave me exposed." "I'll cover you," Sarah said, then looked at the other two Andromedans. "You two create a distraction on the western approach. Draw the patrols away from our actual entry point. Don't engage directly, just make noise and pull them out of position." One of them, a young female named Lyra, hesitated. "What will you be doing?" "Getting the objective while they're looking elsewhere," Sarah replied. They moved into position. Sarah led them through the blind spots she had identified, moving with efficiency that made her teammates work to keep up. When they reached the split point, Vex settled into cover and began working on the facility systems while the other two Andromedans circled wide to create their distraction. Sarah continued alone, slipping through shadows and using terrain features that other students had overlooked. Her training from the Outer Colonies conflict came flooding back, muscle memory taking over as she navigated hostile territory with practiced ease. She could feel Commander Vrath adjusting the simulation, increasing the challenge as he recognized her competence. More enemies spawned ahead of her. Sarah adapted, using tactics she had learned fighting in real urban combat zones. She didn't take direct shots when angled deflections would work. She used environmental elements as weapons, triggering a controlled collapse that blocked a patrol route. She moved constantly, never staying in one position long enough to be targeted. Behind her, Vex successfully disabled half the turrets, and the distraction team had pulled 2 patrol groups completely out of position. Sarah reached the objective, a simulated data core, and prepared to extract when Commander Vrath escalated dramatically. 12 enemy combatants materialized between her and the exit, a challenge designed to be impossible for a single operator. Sarah felt time slow as her combat instincts engaged fully. She analyzed the environment in microseconds, identifying options that most students would never see. Instead of fighting through the enemies, she went up. The facility's ceiling had maintenance access points that the simulation rendered realistically. Sarah used precise shots to create handholds in the structure, climbed rapidly, and traversed above the enemy force while they searched ground level for a target that had disappeared. She reunited with her team at the extraction point with the objective secured and 0 casualties. The simulation ended, and they materialized back in the training lab to absolute silence. Every student was staring at Sarah. Professor Thex's scales had shifted to an intense amber that suggested extreme interest. Commander Vrath and Captain Zena exchanged glances, their scales displaying patterns Sarah recognized from her briefing files as indicating surprise mixed with respect. Marcus's expression was priceless, a mixture of confusion and disbelief that the quiet girl he had dismissed completely had just executed a flawless tactical operation. Commander Vrath approached Sarah directly, studying her with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential prey. "Impressive performance, Miss Chen. Where did you receive combat training?" Sarah met his gaze steadily, maintaining her composure despite knowing that every word she spoke now would be analyzed and investigated. Earth's colonial defense programs, sir. My family lived on an outer colony world. Basic security training was mandatory and I had a good instructor. It was plausible enough to be believable while vague enough to discourage easy verification. Colonial defense programs varied wildly in quality and documentation, and records from the outer colonies conflict were notoriously incomplete due to combat damage to data systems. Basic security training, Captain Zena repeated, her scales flickering with amusement. That was not basic, student. That was professional-grade tactical thinking and execution. You moved like someone with real combat experience. Sarah allowed herself to look slightly uncomfortable, as if she had revealed more than intended. I had good instructors, she repeated, and I've practiced a lot on my own. The Academy's simulations are very helpful for maintaining skills. Professor Thex moved forward, his large frame commanding attention. Miss Chen, you have been in my advanced tactical class for 3 months. You have consistently performed at barely adequate levels. Yet today you demonstrate capabilities that exceed most military academy graduates. How do you explain this discrepancy? The moment of truth. Sarah had prepared for this question, had rehearsed her explanation, but actually delivering it in front of an audience that included 2 Vraxian intelligence officers disguised as cultural liaisons was different from practicing in her room. I didn't want attention, she said simply. After the outer colonies conflict, a lot of colonist refugees faced discrimination. People assumed we were traumatized, broken, damaged by what we experienced. I wanted to be treated like a normal student, not as a victim or a curiosity. So I kept my training to myself. It was a brilliant lie because it contained emotional truth that any sentient being could understand. The desire to be seen as normal, to escape a painful past, to start fresh. The advanced training session was held in a restricted section of the academy that most students never accessed. Sarah arrived to find only 8 others had been selected. 2 Vraxians from the academy's military program, 3 Keltorians with diplomatic security backgrounds, 1 Andromedan tactical specialist, Marcus Webb, and surprisingly, a human woman Sarah vaguely recognized from her xenohistory class named Lieutenant Jessica Park. Sarah had researched Park the moment she learned about the selection. On paper, Park was a transfer student from Earth's military academies, openly serving a term at the Galactic Academy as part of a cross-training program. Her presence here was officially sanctioned, her military service a matter of public record, and her capabilities well documented. She was everything Sarah pretended not to be. Park caught Sarah's eye and nodded acknowledgement, her expression neutral, but her posture suggesting she recognized something in Sarah that others had missed. That was dangerous. Park would have been briefed on the possibility of intelligence operatives at the academy, would know what signs to look for, and would likely report any suspicions through her chain of command. Commander Vrath and Captain Zena waited at the center of the training room, which was significantly larger and more sophisticated than the standard simulation labs. Advanced holographic projectors lined the walls, capable of creating scenarios so realistic that participants frequently forgot they were in a simulation. The Vraxian Empire had provided this technology as part of their cultural exchange agreement, though Sarah suspected it doubled as a way to study how different species responded to their tactical doctrines. Welcome to advanced training, Commander Vrath began, his scales displaying formal patterns that indicated this was serious business, rather than casual instruction. You 9 have been selected because you demonstrated exceptional potential. What we will teach you over the next week goes beyond standard tactical theory. We will introduce you to real combat scenarios drawn from actual military operations. Some of you may find this training disturbing. All of you will find it challenging. Captain Zena stepped forward, her movements precise and controlled. Today's scenario is based on an actual incident from the Vraxian-Keltorian border conflicts 15 years ago. A diplomatic convoy was ambushed in hostile territory. Security forces had to extract the diplomats while under sustained attack from superior numbers. This is not a standard training scenario with obvious solutions. This is chaos management and most of you will fail. The question is how you fail and what you learn from that failure. Sarah felt a spike of adrenaline. The Vraxian-Keltorian border conflicts had been brutal. A 3-year period of low-intensity warfare that killed thousands before diplomatic resolution. If this scenario was truly based on actual events, it would be significantly more complex than anything the Academy typically provided. The 9 students were divided into 3 teams. Sarah found herself paired with Lieutenant Park and one of the Keltorian security specialists, a veteran named Torvin, who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen real combat. The other 2 teams consisted of the remaining students in various combinations. Commander Vrath explained that each team would run the same scenario independently, and their performance would be compared. The scenario involved extracting 3 diplomats from a convoy that had been disabled by explosives, with hostile forces closing in from multiple directions. Available resources included standard security weapons, limited ammunition, unreliable communications, and exactly 7 minutes until enemy reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers. Sarah's team was last to run the scenario, which gave her the advantage of observing the others first. The first team, led by one of the Vraxian students, attempted an aggressive counterattack to establish a security perimeter. They managed to neutralize the initial threat but took casualties and failed to extract all the diplomats before enemy reinforcements arrived. Respectable performance, but not exceptional. The second team, featuring Marcus and the Andromedan specialist, tried a mobile defense strategy, constantly moving while protecting the diplomats. They performed better than the first team, but still lost 1 diplomat when they were forced to abandon a position under heavy fire. When Sarah's team entered the simulation, she immediately assessed the situation with the analytical detachment she had learned during the Outer Colonies conflict. 3 diplomats scattered in damaged vehicles, enemy fire from elevated positions providing overlapping fields of fire, 7 minutes until the situation became completely untenable. "Torven," Sarah said quickly, "you're the most experienced. I need you to lay down suppressing fire on those elevated positions. Don't try to eliminate them. Just keep their heads down. Lieutenant Park, you're with me. We extract the diplomats one at a time, closest to farthest. 3 minutes per extraction, 1 minute contingency. Torvin falls back with us after each extraction." Park studied Sarah with sharp eyes but nodded agreement. Torvin grunted acknowledgement and moved into position, his experience evident in the way he positioned himself to maximize cover while maintaining effective fields of fire. The extraction began. Sarah moved with precision born of actual combat experience, using terrain features that most training scenarios wouldn't include, but that real battlefields always provided. She reached the first diplomat, a panicked Keltorian female, and used firm but calm commands to get her moving. Park covered their withdrawal while Torvin's suppressing fire kept the enemy contained. 2 minutes, 40 seconds. Within parameters. The second diplomat was more challenging, injured and unable to move quickly. Sarah made a split-second decision, directing Park to take him while she provided covering fire. It was a calculated risk, revealing more of her capabilities than she had planned, but the tactical situation demanded it. Her shots were precise, professional, eliminating threats with efficiency that couldn't be attributed to lucky training. Park's expression shifted as she watched Sarah work, recognition dawning in her eyes. She knew now, or at least strongly suspected, that Sarah was far more than a student with colonial defense training. 5 minutes, 10 seconds. Still on schedule. The final diplomat was trapped in the most exposed position, with enemy forces converging rapidly. Sarah made another tactical decision, this one drawing on experience that no civilian should have. She used the damaged vehicles as improvised explosives, timing detonations to create chaos in enemy positions while simultaneously providing cover for their final extraction. It was a technique from the Outer Colonies conflict, one that had saved her unit during a similar situation on a mining asteroid called Theta 7. The fact that she used it here, in this simulation, would tell anyone with knowledge of that operation exactly where she had learned it. Commander Vrath would recognize it. Captain Zena would recognize it, and Lieutenant Park definitely recognized it, her expression now mixing professional respect with deep suspicion. They extracted the final diplomat with 40 seconds to spare, regrouping at the designated safe zone as the simulation ended. Sarah's team had achieved a perfect extraction with 0 casualties, a result that none of the other teams had come close to matching. When they rematerialized in the training room, absolute silence greeted them. Commander Vrath's scales had shifted to a complex pattern that Sarah's briefing files identified as indicating intense interest, mixed with wariness. Captain Zena looked like a predator that had just identified significantly more dangerous prey than anticipated. Professor Thex, who had been observing from the control room, descended to the training floor with movements that suggested barely contained intensity. His scales blazed with colors that Sarah had never seen him display before. Lieutenant Park stepped away from Sarah slightly, creating tactical distance, her hand resting casually near her sidearm in a gesture that looked natural, but Sarah recognized as a defensive posture. Marcus and the other students watched with expressions ranging from awe to confusion, not understanding the sudden tension that had filled the room, but sensing that something significant had just occurred. Commander Vrath approached Sarah slowly, studying her with the focused attention of someone analyzing a potential threat. When he spoke, his voice carried undertones that his translator couldn't quite capture, something between respect and accusation. "The Theta-7 extraction," he said quietly. "I studied that operation at Vraxian Military Command. It was classified human military action, considered a textbook example of improvised tactical brilliance under impossible circumstances. The human commander who planned that extraction received significant commendations, though their identity remained classified. The technique you just employed was identical to that operation, down to the timing of the explosive detonations." Sarah felt the moment crystallize around her, understanding that her cover was about to collapse regardless of what she said next. But years of operational experience had taught her that how you handle exposure often mattered more than the exposure itself. "I had good instructors," she said, meeting Commander Vrath's gaze steadily. "Some of them were veterans of that conflict. They taught me what worked and what didn't using real examples," retending Cass. Captain Rivera's response arrived at Oro 300, exactly when Sarah was beginning to think she wouldn't receive guidance before the next training session. The message was encrypted with protocols that would self-destruct after reading, leaving no trace of communication. "Commander Chen, your exposure was calculated risk that paid off. Continue engagement with Vraxian officers. Priority intelligence suggests they're planning wargame exercises in contested space near Deneb sector within 2 months. Need confirmation of fleet deployment numbers and tactical doctrine they'll employ. Your access to their training methodology is exactly what we need. Park's discretion is acceptable, but monitor her closely. If she reports through official channels, we'll know within 12 hours and initiate extraction. Until then, you're cleared to maintain current operational posture. The intelligence you gather now could prevent a war or help us win one. Your choice on how far to push, but remember that dead heroes don't file reports. Rivera out." Sarah read the message 3 times before letting it dissolve into encrypted fragments. Rivera was giving her operational autonomy, trusting her judgment about how much risk was acceptable. That trust was both empowering and terrifying, because it meant the consequences of failure would rest entirely on Sarah's shoulders. She spent the remaining pre-dawn hours reviewing everything she knew about Vraxian military doctrine, looking for angles she could exploit during continued training. The Vraxians respected warriors who demonstrated both skill and tactical intelligence. If she could position herself as a valuable training partner, rather than just an exceptional student, they might share information more freely. When morning came, Sarah dressed carefully and made her way to the cafeteria, where she knew rumors about yesterday's training session would have spread throughout the student population. She wasn't disappointed. Conversation stopped when she entered, students watching her with new interest that bordered on wariness. The quiet girl who kept her head down had been replaced by someone they couldn't quite categorize. Marcus sat with his usual group, but their dynamic had shifted. He no longer dominated the conversation, and his friends kept glancing toward Sarah as if comparing the Admiral's son to the mysterious girl who had outperformed everyone in advanced tactical scenarios. Kira waved frantically from across the room, surrounded by a cluster of students who clearly wanted introductions. Sarah considered avoiding the situation entirely, then decided that continued visibility served her purposes better than retreating back into isolation. She collected her breakfast and joined Kira's table. "Everyone's talking about you," Kira said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "They're saying you performed better than actual military students in the Vraxian training." "Is it true you used classified human tactics?" Sarah deflected with practiced ease. "People exaggerate. I did well because my instructors taught me to think creatively under pressure. The Vraxian officers were impressed, but lots of students performed well. One of Kira's friends, a Keltorian political science major, leaned forward with intense curiosity. But Commander Vrath specifically mentioned the Theta-7 extraction. That was a legendary operation during the human conflicts. How would you even know about classified military tactics? Veterans talk, Sarah replied simply. After the Outer Colonies conflict, a lot of soldiers returned home with stories. Some of them became instructors in civilian defense programs. They taught us what actually worked in combat, not just textbook theory. I was lucky to learn from people with real experience. It was a brilliant deflection because it was partially true. Veterans did share knowledge, did become instructors, did pass along hard-won tactical wisdom. The fact that Sarah had been one of those veterans rather than their student was a detail she could omit. The conversation continued, with Sarah carefully managing how much information she revealed. She appeared open and honest while actually sharing nothing of substance, a skill she had perfected during intelligence operations where building trust required appearing vulnerable while maintaining operational security, Lieutenant. Park entered the cafeteria midway through breakfast, her eyes immediately finding Sarah. She collected her meal and, after a moment's hesitation, approached the table. Kira's eyes went wide at seeing another human military officer showing interest in Sarah. "Miss Chen," Park said formally, "may I speak with you briefly?" Sarah excused herself and followed Park to a quiet corner. The lieutenant's expression was carefully neutral, but tension showed in her shoulders. "I filed my report last night," Park said quietly. "Routine training assessment. Nothing that would trigger investigation. But I received an interesting response this morning. My commanding officer wants me to extend my stay at the academy by 2 months and requests that I include you in all future training exercises I conduct." "No explanation, just orders." Sarah processed this information rapidly. Someone in Earth's command structure was coordinating their activities. Probably Captain Rivera working through channels that Park wouldn't recognize. They were positioning both women to work together without compromising Sarah's cover or revealing their connection. "I appreciate you telling me," Sarah said carefully. "I know my performance yesterday created complications for you." Park studied her for a long moment. "I don't know what you're really doing here, and after thinking about it all night, I decided I don't want to know. But I'm going to be watching you. And if you endanger anyone at this academy, orders or no orders, I will stop you. Understood?" "Understood," Sarah replied. "I'm not here to cause harm, Lieutenant. Just to learn and maybe contribute what I can." Park nodded slowly, clearly not entirely satisfied but accepting the situation. "The Vraxian officers have requested you specifically for their next training session this afternoon. Something about command-level tactical exercises. I'll be there as well, officially supervising to ensure academy protocols are maintained." That was the real message. Park would be present to monitor Sarah's interactions with the Vraxian officers, gathering her own intelligence about whatever operations Sarah was running. Smart, professional, and exactly what Sarah would have done in her position. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of classes, where Sarah was now the center of attention. Professors who had barely noticed her for 3 semesters suddenly asked her opinions on tactical scenarios and military ethics. Students who had never spoken to her wanted to discuss combat philosophy and human military history. Sarah navigated it all with careful deflection, appearing flattered by the attention, while avoiding substantive discussions that might reveal too much. Professor Thex's advanced tactical class was particularly challenging. The old Dravian warrior watched Sarah with unwavering intensity throughout the entire session, his scales shifting through patterns that suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he understood about human students at the academy. When class ended, he called Sarah to his desk. The other students filed out quickly, sensing this was a private conversation. "Miss Chen," Professor Thex began, his rumbling voice thoughtful. "I have taught at this academy for 12 years. In that time, I have instructed thousands of students from hundreds of species. I have learned to recognize potential, to identify natural talent, and to distinguish between learned skill and combat-tested experience." He paused, his massive eyes fixed on Sarah with uncomfortable precision. "You have combat-tested experience, not simulated, not training scenarios, but actual battlefield experience where real lives were at stake. I do not know how you acquired it or why you chose to hide it. I do not need to know. But I want you to understand that I recognize what you are. even if I cannot prove it. Sarah met his gaze steadily, weighing her options. Lying to Professor Thex would be pointless. The old warrior had seen too much, knew too much, and would detect deception instantly, but acknowledging the truth carried its own risks. If you're right, Sarah said carefully, hypothetically speaking, what would you do with that knowledge? Professor Thex's scale shifted to a deep blue that Sarah's training identified as indicating respect. Nothing. Warriors have reasons for their choices, and I learned long ago not to question the decisions of those who have truly walked through fire. But I would offer advice. Whatever your purpose here, accomplish it quickly. The Academy is becoming interested in you, and interest from powerful institutions rarely ends well for those trying to remain unnoticed. Thank you, Professor, Sarah said sincerely. I appreciate your discretion. I offer no discretion, Thex replied. I simply choose not to speak of things that are not my concern. There is a difference, now go. Commander Vrath expects you in 1 hour, and he is not patient with tardiness. The afternoon training session was held in the same restricted facility, but only 5 students had been invited this time. Sarah, Lieutenant Park, both Vraxian Academy students, and Torvin, the Keltorian veteran. The others from yesterday's session were absent, suggesting Commander Vrath had narrowed his focus to those who demonstrated genuine exceptional capability. Captain Zena greeted them with scales displaying formal military patterns. Today we progress beyond individual tactical scenarios. You will participate in a command